Jobs. Millionaires versus heirs. They choose the right occupation. About 10 years ago, a reporter from a national news magazine called. She asked the question we are most frequently asked: who are the affluent? By now, you probably can predict the answer. Most of the affluent in America are business owners, including self employed professionals. 20% of the affluent households in America are headed by retirees. Of the remaining 80%, more than two-thirds are headed by self-employed business owners, owners of businesses. In America, fewer than 1 in 5 households, or about 18%, is headed by a self-employed business owner or professional. But these self-employed people are 4 times more likely to be millionaires than those who work for others. The reporter followed with the next logical question: what type of businesses do millionaires own? Our answer was the same one we give everyone. You can't predict if someone is a millionaire by the type of business he's in. After 20 years of studying millionaires across a wide spectrum of industries, we have concluded that the character of the business owner is more important in predicting his level of wealth than the classification of his business. But no matter how hard we try to make our point, reporters want to keep things simple. What a great story. What a great headline it would make if they could tell readers, here are 10 businesses millionaires own. We have gone out of our way to emphasize that there are no sure steps one can take to becoming wealthy. Too often, reporters ignore the facts. They sensationalize and twist our research findings. Yes, you are more likely to become affluent if you're self-employed. But what some reporters don't tell you is that most business owners are not millionaires and will never come close to becoming wealthy. We do tell reporters that some industries tend to be more profitable than others. Thus, those who own businesses in the more profitable industries tend, by definition, to realize more income. But just because you're in a profitable industry does not guarantee that your business will be highly productive. And even if your business is highly productive, you may never become wealthy. Why? Because even if you earn big profits, you may spend even bigger amounts on non-business related consumer goods and services. You may have been divorced 3 times or have a habit of gambling on the horses. You may not have a pension plan or own any shares in quality publicly traded corporations. Perhaps you feel little need to accumulate wealth. Money in your mind may be the most easily renewable resource. If you think it is, you may be a spender and never an investor. But what if you're frugal and conscious investor and you own a business that is profitable? In this case, you're likely to become wealthy. It is easier to earn high profits in some industries than others. We identify several of these profitable industries in this chapter. But again, we caution readers to oversimplify our findings and suggestions. Too often, people want a soundbite answer to the question of how to become wealthy in America. Even worse are those who distort our data-based findings. Consider along these lines the message that was recently left for us by a business broker. I thought you would like to know that someone has printed a brochure stating that you are a professor at Stanford University and that you found that 20% of millionaires in America are dry cleaners. Is this true? First, neither one of us ever taught at Stanford. Second, neither of us ever stated that 1 in 5 millionaires is at this moment pressing shirts. We did find that in the mid-1980s that dry cleaning was a profitable small business industry. But again, profits don't automatically translate into affluence or accumulated wealth. This is like there's sons of ours and perhaps yours who thought they would make the varsity basketball team because they bought a pair of Air Jordan shoes. A label does not make a varsity player, nor does an industry label make the business owner wealthy. It takes talent and discipline to generate profits and ultimately wealth. That is why we are offended by people who tell the American public, just buy my educational study at home kit and your new business venture will be a success. Start your own business today. You will be wealthy tomorrow. I did it in this industry. You can too. It's so easy. Again, it's not a kit, not the idea, not the industry. For example, the profitability data for hardware lumber retail establishments 25 years ago never got us excited. They didn't convince us to invest in a business of this type. But think what the founders of highly profitable Home Depot did. They reinvented the industry. They did not allow industry standards for profits, sales volume, or overhead to dictate how they operated their business and invested their money. These founders had tremendous talent, discipline, and courage. They became wealthy and helped make a lot of their employees and other investors financially independent. Most people who make it big in business set their own very high standards. Only change is predictable. Things do change, even in the so-called owner-manager business environment. Take, for example, the industry we mentioned previously, dry cleaning. In fact, the appropriate title is laundries, dry cleaning, and garment services. With regard to this industry, Tom Stanley reported in 1988, in 1984, there were 6,940 partnerships. 91.9% have net income, while the average return on receipts was 23.4%. What about the profitability of this industry in the 1990s? We analyzed the IRS federal income tax return data. In 1992, we determined that there were 4,615 partnerships. Only 50.5% had any net income, while the average return on receipts was 13%. Also in 1992, there were 24,186 sole proprietorship dry cleaners in America. What was their average net income? On average, it was 5,360. This was placed dry cleaners 116th out of 171 sole proprietorships based on average net income criteria. The industry at that time ranked 119th in return on receipts, which equaled 8.1%. What percentage of dry cleaners generated a net income? Nearly 3 in 4, or 74.1%, made at least $1 of net income. In this regard, dry cleaning ranked 92 out of 171 industries analyzed. What a difference 8 short years can make. But the dry cleaning industry is not the only one to encounter such changes. The data in Table 8.1 contrasts selected industries. You will notice that several have experienced significant changes in profitability over the years. The number of men's and boys' clothing furnishing stores, for example, more than doubled from 1984 to 1992. In 1984, all the sole proprietorships in that industry made a profit, but in 1992, only 82.7% were profitable. Its rank in this regard dropped from 1st to 57th among the 171 sole proprietorships studied. The highway and street construction contractor industry moved from a ranking of 8 to 138, while coal mining moved from 14 to 165. Many external and often uncontrollable factors influence the probability of industries and firms within those industries. Often, the presence of high numbers of profitable firms within an industry attracts more and more people to the industry, which can have a dampening effect on profits. Changes in consumer preferences can also affect profits. So can the actions of our government. If it had an energy policy that favored the use of coal, perhaps the number of sole proprietorship coal mining businesses would not have dropped from 717 to 76 in just 8 years. Note that only 34.2% of the 76 coal mining businesses made a profit. But in spite of this, sole proprietorships in this business earned an average net income of $196,618. Obviously, a minority of coal mining operations owners ignore industry trends and standards, and many of these people have been rewarded for their tenacity and contrary beliefs about the coal industry. Many successful business owners have told us that they enjoy the short periods of rough times in their chosen industries because they weed out much of the competition. This seems to be the case in the coal mining industry. The 34.2% of the businesses in the industry that were profitable had a net income of approximately $600,000. So interesting. Many people ask us, should I go into business for myself? Most people have no business ever working for themselves. The average net income for the more than 15 million sole proprietorships in America is only $6,200. Only 25% of sole proprietorships do not make 1 cent of profit during a typical year. It's even worse for partnerships. 42% on average make no profits in a year. What about corporations? Only 55% have any taxable income during a typical 12-month period. Self-employed professionals versus other business owners. Fewer than 1 in 5 millionaire business owners turns his business over to his children to own and operate. Why? Give credit to wealthy parents. They know the odds of succeeding in business. They understand that most businesses are highly susceptible to competition, counter consumer trends, high overhead, and other uncontrollable variables like COVID. So, what do these millionaires advise their children to do? They encourage their children to become self-employed professionals such as physicians, attorneys, engineers, architects, accountants, and dentists. As stated earlier, millionaire couples with children are 5 times more likely to send their children to medical school than other parents in America, and about 4 times more likely to send them to law school. The affluent know the risks and the odds of succeeding or failing in business. They also seem to understand that only a small minority of self-employed professionals fail to make a profit in any given year, and that the profitability of most professional service firms is substantially higher than the average for small business in general. We will elaborate on these issues with hard numbers, but first let's discuss the other attributes associated with being a self-employed professional. For a moment, assume that you are Mr. Carl Johnson, the sole proprietor of Johnson Coal. You're the owner of one of the 26 coal mining businesses that made a profit last year out of the 76 in the industry. Not long ago, 717 sole proprietors were still in the industry. More than 9 of every 10 made a profit. Now the industry has been reduced in number by 90%. But you're tough, you're resourceful, and you're intelligent. In spite of the withdrawal of most of the other operators, you hung in there. Now you're reaping the benefits. You made a net profit of $600,000 last year, and you're doing well this year. And now you have 2 children in college who are outstanding students. You begin to ask yourself some questions. Should I encourage my David and Christy to become involved in the coal mining business? Should I encourage them to eventually take over my parents' coal mine? Is coal mining the best place for my children? Most of the millionaire business owners we have interviewed would not encourage their children to take over such a business. This is especially true in the case in which children are outstanding students. They would suggest that David and Christy, the young scholars, consider other avenues. Most businesses today require some investment in land, equipment, and buildings. The Johnson coal mining business owns mountains that contain coal. It owns millions of dollars worth of equipment. It employs many miners and must constantly upgrade the safety of its operation. It must conform to OSHA's mandates. It must deal with the uncontrollable price the market places on a ton of coal. It must constantly be vigilant about competitors who are trying to steal its customers. It must keep a careful watch on changes in America's energy policy. It also must keep its workers happy and safe. It must constantly deal with the possibility of a mine cave-in and halted production. Finally, the operation is in a fixed location. Mountains can't be moved to a warmer climate or closer to a more efficient railroad operation. What happens if there is a prolonged railroad strike? Ask yourself these questions. If you do, you will soon realize you're in a precarious position. So what if you run a superior operation? The uncontrollable factor outlined above can kill your business. Given the considerations, that $600,000 you earned last year seems smaller. How many $600,000 years are in your future? What if the uncontrollable factors drive you bankrupt next year? Can you use your skills to teach coal mining at the technical university? Probably not. Your skills are more hands-on, not intellectual. We once asked an affluent business owner who had fled Europe because of the Holocaust why all his adult children were self-employed professionals. His response: they can take your business, but they can't take your intellect. What does this mean? A government and or a creditor can confiscate a business composed of land, machinery, coal pits, buildings, and so on. It can't confiscate your intellect. What do professionals sell? Not coal, not paint, not even pizza. What they sell most of all is their intellect. Physicians, for example, can take their intellect anywhere in America. Their resources are quite portable. The same is true for dentists, attorneys, accountants, engineers, architects, veterinarians, and chiropractors. These are the occupations held by the disproportionate number of sons and daughters of affluent couples throughout America. What about the income characteristics of professionals as compared with the Johnson coal mining operation? Only a minority of self-employed professionals have ever made such a $600,000 profit in a single year, and most self-employed professionals spend many years in training, which is costly both in dollars and time. Nevertheless, most affluent parents believe that the lifetime benefit associated with being a professional greatly outweighs the cost. Remember, most of these parents pay all or a significant portion of their son's or daughter's tuition and fees for training. Their vote is with their hard-earned money. How will you vote? Notice that coal mining on average produced a higher net income than any of the sole proprietorships listed in Table 8.2. But what proportion of coal mining operations made any net income during the same period of time? Only about 1 in 3. This is a sharp contrast with the percentage of profitable businesses in each of the professional service categories listed in Table 8.2. What percentages were profitable? About 87.2% of the offices of physicians, 94.4% of the offices of dentists, 92.5% of the offices of veterinarians, and 86.6% of the offices providing legal services. Also examine the average return on receipts. On average, it would take $2.4 million in receipts for a coal mining operation on average to generate a net income of $196,000. What about physicians? The average net income of physician's office is $87,000. That's 56.2% of the 154,804 receipts generated. With that kind of return on receipts, how many dollars in receipts would a physician's office have to generate to earn same average net income that coal mining business earned? Only about $349,800, a far cry from the $2.4 million required of coal mining operations. The figure even lower for osteopathic physicians. On average, they require receipts of $340,000 to earn expected $196,000 in net income. Legal service providers, on average, would need to generate $414,800 in sales to earn what the average coal mine operation earned in net income. What will you advise David and Christy to do? If you're like most successful business owners, you will advise them to become professionals. So it is with the affluent in America. The first generation affluent are typically entrepreneurs. They beat the odds. Their businesses succeed, and they become affluent. Much of their success depends on their living a frugal existence while building their businesses. Luck is often involved, and most who succeed understand that circumstances could have gone against them. Their children will have it better. They will not have to make significant risks. They will be well educated. They will become physicians, attorneys, and accountants. Their capital is their intellect. But unlike their parents, they will postpone entering the job market until they are in their late 20s and even their early 30s. And most likely, they will adopt an upper middle class lifestyle as soon as they start working. A much different lifestyle than their frugal parents had when they started their businesses. Often their children are not frugal. How could they be? They have high status positions that require a higher level of consumption and thus lower levels of investing. As a consequence, they may require economic outpatient care. In spite of earning high incomes, as most professionals do, they are obligated to spend, because they are corresponding high levels of household spending requirements for many high income producing categories of businesses. It is difficult to predict levels of wealth based on the income characteristics of various types of businesses. Dual, normal businesses, and the affluent. A recent article in Forbes had an interesting lead. Dual companies with steady earnings growth may not make for stimulating cocktail party chatter, but over the long term, they make the best investments. Later in the same article, the author mentions that in the long run, high-tech companies can often fall down on the performance scale. Typically, it's the companies in which we call the dual normal industries that consistently perform well for their owners. Forbes lists several top-performing small businesses that have great endurance for the past 10 years. Some of the industries represented include wallboard manufacturing, building material manufacturing, electronic stores, prefab housing, and automobile parts. No, these industries don't sound very exciting, but typically it's these mundane categories of businesses that produce wealth for their owners. Often dual normal industries don't attract a great deal of competition, and demand for their offering is not usually subject to rapid downturns. We recently developed our own list of businesses that are owned by millionaires. We would like to list just a sample of this at this juncture. What businesses do the affluent own? A wide variety of dual normals, risk or freedom. Why do people operate their own businesses? First, most successful business owners will tell you that they have tremendous freedom. They own their house, they are their own bosses. Also, they tell us that self employment is less risky than working for others. A professor once asked a group of 60 MBA students who were executives of public corporations this question: what is risk? One student replied, being an entrepreneur. His fellow students agreed. But then the professor answered his own question with a quote from an entrepreneur. What is risk? Having one source of income. Employees are at risk. They have a single source of income. What about the entrepreneur who sells janitorial services to your employers? He has hundreds and hundreds of customers, hundreds and hundreds of sources of income. Actually, there is considerable financial risk in being a business owner, but business owners have a set of beliefs that help them reduce their risk, or at least their perceived risk. I am in control of my own destiny. Risk is working for a ruthless employer. I can solve any problem. The only way to become a CEO is to own the company. There are no limits on the amount of income I can make. I get stronger and wiser every day by facing risk and adversity. To be a business owner also requires that you have the desire to be self-employed. If you hate the thought of being outside the corporate environment, entrepreneurship may not be your calling. The most successful business owners we have interviewed have one characteristic in common. They all enjoy what they do. They all take pride in going it alone. Consider what a multimillionaire once told us about being self-employed. There are more people, employees today, working at all jobs that they don't like. I'll tell you honestly that the successful man is a guy who works at a job, who likes his work, who can't wait to get up in the morning, to get down to the office, and that's my criteria. And I've always been that way. I can't wait to get up, get down to the office, and get my job underway. For this fellow, a widower without children, it's not the money. In fact, his estate plan calls for his wealth to go to an undergraduate scholarship fund at his alma mater. How did this fellow and others like him select the businesses they wanted to start? He was well trained in college by engineering and science professors, many of whom were also entrepreneurs. These professors were his role models. Most successful business owners had some knowledge or experience with their chosen industry before they ever opened their own businesses. Larry, for example, worked far more than a dozen years selling printing services. He was the top performer for his employer. But after growing tired of the constant fear that his employer would go bankrupt, he considered opening his own printing company. He sought our advice in this regard. We asked Larry a simple question: what's the number one thing that printing companies need? He immediately responded, more business, more revenue, more customers. Thus, Larry answered his own question. He did start his own business, but not his own printing company. He became self-employed broker of printing services. He now represents several outstanding printing firms and receives a commission on every sale he makes. His business has little overhead. Before starting his own business, Larry told us he did not have the courage to be an entrepreneur. He told us that every time he thought about going it alone, he encountered fear. Larry believed that the self-employed were fearless, that fear never entered their minds. We had to help Larry adjust his thinking. He began by explaining that his definition of courage was wrong. How do we define courage? Courage is behaving in a way that conjures up fear. Yes, Larry, courageous people, entrepreneurs, recognize the fear in what they are doing, but they deal with it. They overcome their fears. That's why they are successful. We have spent a considerable amount of time studying courageous people. Certainly, Ray Kroc had enormous courage to think he could market food to the world. Remember that he was an ambulance driver on the front lines in World War I. So was Walt Disney. Lee Iacocca had to have an enormous courage to tell Congress and the world that Chrysler would come back big time. He did not fit the strict definition of an entrepreneur, but in our minds he has an entrepreneurial blood in his veins. Fear abounds in America, but according to our research, who has less fear and worry? Would you guess it's the person with the $5 million trust account or the self-made entrepreneur worth several million dollars? Typically, it's the entrepreneur, the person who deals with risk every day, who tests his or her courage every day. In this way, he learns to conquer fear. We saved the following case study for last because, in our minds, it encapsulates the difference between PAWs and UAWs. Throughout this book, we have stressed that the number of these two groups have distinctly different needs. PAWs need to achieve, to create wealth, to display financially independent, to build something from scratch. UAWs more often need to display a high status lifestyle. What happens when members of these two groups attempt to occupy the same space at the same time? As the following case study demonstrates, the likely result is conflict. Mr. W is a self-made millionaire with a net worth conservatively estimated to be over $30 million, a typical PAW. Mr. W is the owner of several companies that produce industrial equipment, testing instruments, and specialty gauges. He is also involved in many other entrepreneurial activities, including real estate ventures. Mr. W lives in a middle-class neighborhood surrounded by people who have only a small fraction of the wealth he has accumulated. He and his wife drive full-size General Motors sedans. His living and consuming habits are quite middle class. He never wears a tie or suit to work. Mr. W enjoys venturing into, as he calls it, luxury real estate. I make money outside of the business in real estate. God continues to make more people, but he doesn't make any more land. You will make money if you're smart and you're choosy where you pick the spot. Mr. W is very picky indeed. He buys property outright in a partnership only when the price is right. He typically purchases property or a part ownership from an owner and or a developer who is in great need of financial assistance. Recently, he uncovered yet another superior investment opportunity in Sun Country. Some poor guy was putting together a luxury high-rise condominium for a builder to build. He had to have 50% of units sold, so I went in and made a deal with him. I bought all the units of the same style floor plan with a lot of leverage, and he got his money. He built. Because I bought all one style, anybody who wanted to buy that style had to see me. Like Monopoly, nobody ever competes with me. I sell them all right out, all but one. But Mr. W does not even keep the one remaining unit for very long. He and his family use it for a short vacation or two. Occasionally he invites his close friends to use it. Otherwise he rents the remaining units until it is sold. Why doesn't Mr. W maintain a more permanent presence in these condominium complexes? It's not his style. Most of the people who buy Mr. W's vacation condominiums are upper middle class UAWs. Mr. W and many of the buyers of his condominium units have had a number of disagreements. In several of the complexes where Mr. W previously bought units, his buyers passed so many restrictive covenants that Mr. W was uncomfortable even spending vacation time in his condominiums. Thus, he felt compelled to sell that one remaining unit in each of these complexes. I have a dog. Call him Six-Figure Doggy. I have sold several condominiums because the people passed dog laws, they told me. You know, you've got to get rid of the dog. I'll sell an entire building before I get rid of my dog. Mr. W anticipated that the status-conscious buyers of his latest venture would also be insensitive to his desire to have a dog. So before construction on the complex was even started, he listed his dog in the building's declaration. It stated that Mr. W and his family would have the right to have a dog with them when they were in the residence. All the buyers, according to Mr. W, were given copies of the declaration. Thus, they were all aware of Mr. W's right to have a dog in the complex. Not one owner objected at the time they purchased property, but shortly after the complex was completely sold out, excluding Mr. W's last available unit, the owners banded together and formed an action committee. Its purpose was to develop and enforce an expanded list of restrictive covenants. Certainly, these new covenants would not restrict the rights of Mr. W and his dog. After all, these rights were specified in the original declaration. The action committee passed a dog law. It sidestepped the original declaration concerning dogs and stated that dogs would be allowed on the complex, with certain restrictions, if they weighed less than 15 pounds. So much for doggy rights and original declarations. Mr. W felt that this was a subterfuge to encourage him to sell out. His six-figure doggy weighed 30 pounds. He felt that even if the dog dieted, it could not come into compliance. Mr. W. was particularly disturbed that he was never allowed to cast a vote for or against the dog-related covenant. Nonetheless, he was determined to keep his dog in spite of the covenant. After all, he had been a major investor in the building before construction even began. They, the Action Committee, wrote me a letter and stated that I had to get rid of the dog because it was over 15 pounds. So I went to one of their meetings. I complained about their voting system. I had no representation. Just prior to leaving the meeting, Mr. W. addressed the committee. How do you know he's over 15 pounds? How do you know? He could be hollow. I won't get rid of the dog. A few days after the meeting, the head of the Action Committee cornered Mrs. W. while she was walking her dog. He told her in a legalese tone, "Get rid of the dog. You're in violation of our covenant." Later that afternoon, Mrs. W. told her husband what had transpired. She was noticeably upset about the encounter. He advised her to stay calm. Several weeks later, Mr. W. received a letter that demanded that he remove his dog. It also stated that the legal action would be initiated if he did not comply with the dog-related covenant. 2 more letters followed. Each contained statements that were even more threatening than the first. Mr. W. was not impressed with these requests. The author of the letters was the chairman of the Action Committee. He was also an attorney, but as Mr. W. discovered, the chairman was not licensed to practice law in the state where the complex was located. Thus, Mr. W. promptly ignored each of the Action Committee's demands. However, Mr. W. and his family began to feel that they were out of place even just vacationing at this condominium complex. Was the Action Committee using the dog as leverage to evict his entire family? Mr. W. was convinced this was the real issue. He and his family were not what some would consider to be beautiful people. In contrast, the complex was filled with, in Mr. W.'s parlance, the best scrubbed condominium odors one could ever imagine. Mr. W. was growing increasingly angry with the members of the Action Committee. He felt that its members were going out of their way to be rude to him. He was especially annoyed that the chairman of the committee had embarrassed his wife in front of several other condominium owners. Mr. W. devised a plan. At a meeting of the condominium owners at which all the members of the Action Committee were present, Mr. W. stood up and introduced himself. "I'm the guy that you have been sending letters to about our dog. I have given your proposal some careful consideration. I have decided I'm not going to get rid of my dog, nor am I going to sell my condominium." This statement drew anticipated boos and hisses from the audience. After gaining the undivided attention of his targeted audience, he outlined his counterproposal. To turn his condominium unit over to his company's profit-sharing and pension plan and allow assembly line employees to use the unit as a vacation resort 52 weeks a year. He asked his audience, "Would you be okay with all of you? Would that be okay with all of you folks?" Numerous members of the audience moaned. They were undoubtedly envisioning Mr. W.'s blue-collar employees invading their space 52 weeks a year. Some attendees shouted out, "Keep the dog! Keep the dog!" The chairman of the Action Committee proposed that a committee meeting be held immediately in the adjoining conference room. 5 minutes after this behind closed-door meeting, the committee members filed back into the room. The chairman told the audience condominium owners that the Action Committee had made the decision. After reviewing all the elements of the situation, the Action Committee recommends that the W's be allowed to keep their dog. I ask that the covenant be so amended. All in favor. Not long after this brilliant victory, the W's sold their condominium unit. They did so because, as Mr. W. observed, "I don't want to live in a building with people who don't like dogs." According to Mr. W., his dog was very important to him and his family, so much so that they sold the unit at a bargain price. They have sold other units in other complexes in which people were hostile to their dog. So, how much is that doggy in the condominium worth? To the W's, it's worth several hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's how much he estimates he lost in selling the unit at below market value. A hostile environment, even an atmosphere of beautiful people, is not a good place for dogs or for prodigious accumulators of wealth. Hope you enjoyed Millionaire Next Door. Yay!